The AI and crypto guru from the US is saying something here that's shaking up the entire Bitcoin market. And this is also leading to a massive sell-off of Bitcoin for now. We're seeing the highly anticipated press conference that has turned into not just a nothing burger, but even a sell-off. I even mentioned that it could possibly turn into a nothing burger. But now there's even more to it, because the high expectations couldn't be met. Even though they were talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve here. It was clearly stated here that they are evaluating the implementation of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And here, the word Bitcoin was definitely used. But 99% of this conference wasn't about Bitcoin. But this was about stablecoins. This is about digital assets. And that's ultimately what it's for. To further strengthen the dominance of the US dollar. And many people who are now expecting, okay, now comes the big announcement that we are going to announce something. Here to buy Bitcoin or anything like that, they would be disappointed here. That could definitely be the case. It might just be a random correlation, and it has nothing to do with each other. But you can clearly see it in the chart. Here you can see the press conference, here the crypto event, here. David Sachs is in the picture. And then you see it, bam, Bitcoin is massively selling off by several $1,000s. And that's a pattern we've seen several times now. The last few weeks, there were a lot of big events here. Here too. Executive orders. Then something would be expected from Cynthia Loomis. Or then something from Donald Trump would be expected to be announced. If Bitcoin is being bought, it wouldn't be announced that Bitcoin is being bought, but rather that Bitcoin is being evaluated. And now we see the same thing again, which means the same pattern over and over, huge expectations, and then there's a sell-off. But then people realize that what's happening here isn't so bad after all, and might even be positive in the long run. We're going to dive into what's being said here, and why that's not so negative in the long run. How this might initially be reflected in the Bitcoin price. Because we really need to read between the lines what's happening here exactly. And that's definitely positive in the long run. Bullish for Bitcoin is definitely not a time for weekends right now. Because we're only going up and only looking up. So it's a real roller coaster ride, which of course isn't a problem for hardcore hodlers. But for newcomers, beginners, and such, this can be really, really problematic. They then go out of here. Don't let yourselves be unsettled. Here again. The warning to you all, hey, don't let yourselves be shaken by any short-term things, but look at it from a long-term perspective. That's always the case. Now, everyone is waiting. Some big countries and so on are buying up a strategic Bitcoin reserve. But make it clear to yourselves, hey, no, Bitcoin needs the US here, not Bitcoin needs a stockpile here, not Bitcoin needs anyone here. Not just anyone like Donald Trump, but the Donald Trumps of the USA and so on, they all need Bitcoin. And that's why you always have to look at it from a long-term perspective. Sure, if any announcements come out here, we're buying 1 million Bitcoin, we're building up a stockpile and so on. Is Bitcoin going to shoot up massively, pumping? Then we have a massive positive spike here in the short term. But in the long run, that changes relatively little. In the long run, Bitcoin is going to do its thing. With Donald Trump, without Donald Trump, with the USA or without the USA. But hey, let's take a look now. What the crypto Caesar, David Sachs has said exactly here.
One of the things that the president instructed us to do was to evaluate the idea for a Bitcoin reserve, and so that is one of the things. That's one of the first things we're going to look at as part of the internal working group in the administration.
That's already super bullish, guys. Most people didn't really catch on to that. I have that feeling. I don't understand why the Bitcoin price is being sold off like this right now. But yeah, it doesn't really matter anyway. In any case, just a few days ago, it was said that a crypto reserve would be evaluated here. Now, all of a sudden, no one is talking about a crypto reserve anymore. Now, all of a sudden, David Sachs is talking about a Bitcoin reserve. Of course, I would say on the other side of the press conference, there will also be a lot of talk about stablecoins and blah, 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 crypto, digital assets, things like that. But here he makes it very clear, hey, this is about a Bitcoin reserve. That's going to be one of the first things we tackle here. So it's not like we're pushing this to the back burner. This whole thing is a priority here. And that's also the statement that keeps coming up. That Donald Trump definitely gives crypto, Bitcoin, a certain priority. And the priority is now being passed on to David Sachs, or rather, the crypto. AISIS have passed on, who clearly says, hey, we're going to look into this. If that makes sense here, then we will definitely be ready here too. Buying Bitcoin, because that means a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which ultimately means having Bitcoin here.
Group in the administration. So as soon as we get all that set up, we're still waiting for some cabinet secretaries who are on the working group to get confirmed. So we're still in the very early stages of this, but that's one of the first things we're gonna look at is the feasibility of a Bitcoin reserve. I think the concept of the sovereign wealth fund is a little separate, and you'd have to talk to Secretary Lutnick, or soon to be Secretary Lutnick, about that.
They basically need to pull all the working groups together now. They basically need to do the groundwork here first. Then they'll evaluate all of that. And then it was also very, very exciting that they're also going to touch on the Sovereign Wealth Fund here. And in the end, it's also very interesting. Here's the statement that basically the structural stockpile or the Bitcoin stockpile has nothing to do with the US Sovereign Fund. So on one hand, we have the Sovereign Fund, which is being pushed forward by Howard Lutnick. On the other hand, we have the stockpile that's being pushed forward by David Sachs. And in the best case scenario, it could even go so far that both entities or both funds will ultimately buy Bitcoin. So on one hand, we would have Bitcoin in the stockpile. On the other hand, we would have Bitcoin here in the Sovereign Fund, maybe even in different variations. For example, in the stockpile, it would definitely make more sense to buy the Bitcoin directly. In the World Fund, in the Server World Fund, you could possibly buy it through an ETF or something like that. I mean, ideally, you'd buy everything directly. Put Bitcoin directly onto the hardware wallet. That would definitely always be the best. And then we also can't forget that there are still states. There are also more and more states here in the US that want to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So that means we now have potential positions in 3 different areas in the U.S. Bitcoin. But we also have to say, in the end, nothing has really happened. We always have these really big statements, really big claims being thrown around. Yeah, hey, we're evaluating that, we're checking it out. Okay, to be honest, you have to say that at the Sovereign Wealth Fund, they aren't even talking about Bitcoin yet. In the end, it's just the interpretation of a whole lot of people that it would make sense here to include Bitcoin. Here, the word Bitcoin hasn't been officially mentioned yet. Now, here in the stockpile, the word Bitcoin is officially being mentioned. In the States, in the stockpile, the word Bitcoin is also officially being mentioned. We just have to wait and see how this all develops. But what we also need to consider here, which is also very, very important, because only about 1% of the press conference was actually about Bitcoin. And the rest was just about stablecoins and so on. And that was probably really what the market didn't like here. For sure, there's still an interesting statement about that. Here it says now, that was obviously the spread of the dominance of the digital dollar through stablecoins. And here it basically says, first of all, you're increasing the supply of stablecoins. So that means even more nations are getting stablecoins. That, for example, stablecoins are being widely used in Argentina. For all I care, in El Salvador, in all the countries that don't directly have the US dollar. But maybe they just want the US dollar in some way, maybe they don't have access to it, which just increases the demand for the US dollar even more. That's obviously good for the USA. Because here it says, secondly, that in turn drives the Bitcoin price up and absorbs liquidity without inflating the real assets here. So that is ultimately the second statement in the statement, that of course the dollar will dominate if there are more stablecoins. And not for dollars plus in normal cash or somehow bank reserves, but here also in stablecoins. That will basically lead to Bitcoin being pumped further up here. Because simply here, USDT or stablecoins, the biggest on and off ramp here are for Bitcoin. And if more people are just in USDT, in stablecoins, or whatever, USDC, it doesn't matter what kind of stablecoins, then the barrier to getting into Bitcoin is also lower. Much, much smaller. If you're already in a stablecoin, then you might already have a rough idea. Okay, how does self-custody work? Because that's the cool thing about stablecoins, you can generally hold them in self-custody. Even though I'm still very, very critical about this. When it comes to stablecoins, with stablecoins, it always sounds that's really cool. In the end, it still means that we have ongoing inflation, that we still have forced money, that we still have censorship, that we still don't have freedom money, that we still don't have decentralization, like we do with Bitcoin, and that we especially don't have a fixed supply like with Bitcoin. That's why you always have to look at it very, very critically. And at the same time, it also means that the dominance of the US dollar isn't actually getting weaker, but will actually get stronger. It's called, thirdly, the US yield will drop, and that's simply related to it. That through stablecoins, if there's demand for stablecoins, more stablecoins will be minted. And these stablecoins are backed by US government bonds. So here, government bonds are being bought, especially short-term government bonds. This also means that the demand for US dollars is going up. If more government bonds are bought here, then the interest rates will also drop. And when interest rates drop, it makes it even easier to keep the Ponzi scheme going. Because the Ponzi scheme of the US dollar necessarily needs low interest rates. Only when interest rates are low can more debt securities be issued outward. So then it can keep getting more and more in debt. And if the interest rates go up to the max, then the debt just gets so high that at some point you won't be able to afford the interest payments anymore. And then the whole Ponzi scheme blows up. And that's why it's obviously in the interest of the US to promote stablecoins here, because the demand for US dollars is rising. Then the interest rates drop here. And fourthly, it means here, the spread of the digital dollar worldwide. And that's what I've already pointed out here, that dollars will be spread around. So the question here is, what's the deal with Bitcoin? Is it going to be positive or negative? Here's the thing with Bitcoin, because a lot of people say that, yeah, for example, the biggest argument for Bitcoin is a collapsing dollar or a crumbling fiat money system. But if the dollar can be further strengthened through stablecoins, some people might see that as pessimistic or negative here. Could it be that this is ultimately the reason? Why is the market reacting so negatively here? If the Bitcoin or crypto bubble doesn't want the dollar to be further strengthened, they might take that into account too. But above all, it's really about what people want. That Bitcoin is further strengthened here. And what we can take away from this is, from the conference, it's not about pumping the Bitcoin price massively up, but it's about strengthening the US dollar. And maybe a side effect of that is that Bitcoin gets pumped up. But it's not primarily about pumping Bitcoin up. It's not primarily about pushing the regulation of Bitcoin forward. That might also be a side effect or a secondary thing. But the number one topic that came out of the conference here in the US is that they want to keep strengthening the dollars. That's the argument too, that many bring. Okay, the Bitcoin in the stockpile isn't being bought to have a decentralized alternative here, to give people more freedom or something like that. But it's solely about that, to keep the dollar Ponzi scheme going. And if you include Bitcoin in the stockpile, you can have some trust again, pumping it into the system. Maybe you can also bring the yields down. Then, of course, you can kick off a new printing spree, and then you can inflate the whole thing even more. David Bailey also made a very, very interesting statement. He says here, the market completely misunderstands today's press conference. A strategic Bitcoin reserve is being established. That's the top priority. Straight from Donald Trump. They're gathering the highest officials in the country to come up with a plan over the next 80 days. Half of the working group is made up of Bitcoin. A strategic Bitcoin reserve is happening. And that's ultimately a very, very important statement. You can never really guarantee that, David Bailey is very, very confident. He also has direct contact with Donald Trump. But in the end, you just don't know for sure if it's going to happen or not. But according to David Bailey, it looks very, very likely. And that's why he says, hey, he doesn't understand why the market is correcting here. That's basically the argument that Adam Beck keeps bringing up. I saw him just 2 or 3 days ago at the Bitcoin conference here in El Salvador. He basically always says, hey, there's currently an information asymmetry. That means there are so many good, positive news stories that the market is either misjudging, that the market is ignoring or hasn't even realized yet, that this is happening here, that in the background so many positive regulations are taking place. Now, with the Sovereign Wealth Fund coming in, then all the states want to accumulate Bitcoin. And then especially the strong support here from all the politicians. Even if we take a look, the states, all the bills that have been introduced here, where Bitcoin is basically supposed to be added as part of the strategic Bitcoin reserve. If we take a look at what those voting values were, there were some really high voting rates that were here for the strategic Bitcoin reserve. So it wasn't like it was 50-50, but there were actually times when it was 80%. That people who had a say here voted for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And the people who voted against it were simply outnumbered here. And that's basically what a lot of people might need to argue. For example, saying, hey, it's actually good that it hasn't happened right away, because that way you can create even more majorities in the Senate, in the banking committee, in politics, and so on. Because the more Bitcoin you want to buy here, the more support you need at the political level, and the support that's being created right now. Because right now the orange pilling is happening, the information exchange is taking place, and that can be the foundation to buy a lot of Bitcoin here. Because if you just pushed it through now, you wouldn't have the political support here. And then it would be harder to do that here, buy a lot of Bitcoin. So feel free to write in the comments below what you think about it, whether you see it negatively or if you actually see it positively in the long run. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link down there to 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin. Here you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code Bitcoin. See you folks. See you later. Here are greetings from the beach. Peace out.